Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And those who don't know me, I'm Tim Hitchens. I'm the president of the college, and it's my great honour to do a brief introduction to our speaker tonight. So tonight's Syme Lecture will be given by Professor Richard Saller, the Kleinheit's Family Professor of European Studies and Professor of Classics and History at Stanford University. Richard has been Dean of the School of Humanities and Sciences at Stanford, as well as Provost and Dean of the Social Sciences Division at the University of Chicago. He taught at Swarthmore College and held visiting professorships and fellowships at the University of California, Berkeley, and Jesus College, Cambridge, and he got his PhD from Cambridge in 1978. His research focuses on Roman social and economic history, in particular patronage relations, the family, and the imperial economy. He uses literary, legal, and epigraphic materials, as well as computer simulations, to investigate issues of social hierarchy, gender distinctions, and economic production. What perhaps distinguishes his scholarship is an awareness of the importance of the personal. His understanding of patronage, for example, showed that what mattered was who you knew rather than or as much as what your skills or experience were, even in the apparently structured administrative system of the Roman Empire at its height. In his later studies of demography and the Roman economy, he makes extensive use of the social sciences to understand and explain the way individuals behaved. His publications include the Cambridge Economic History of the Greco-Roman World, Patriarchy, Property, and Death in the Roman Family, Personal Patronage under the Early Empire, and the Roman Empire, Economy, Society, and Culture. He was elected a Fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2005. So please join me in welcoming Richard Saller.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. It's a great pleasure to be here. This is a special occasion for me, not only because it's the first time that I've put on a tie in 2 years, but also because it's a lecture in honor of Sir Ronald Syme. In 1970, 50 years ago, when I changed my major at the University of Illinois from engineering to ancient history, the first book I ordered from Blackwell's was Sir Ronald Syme's Roman Revolution. And I did that because it was the most important book in Roman history of its time. So it's a special honor to be able to celebrate his memory in the lecture this evening. Now, I have to say that I don't think he would have been particularly interested in this topic, Pliny's Roman economy, the consequences of empire. He was a political historian above all. The reason that I chose this topic is that it's been the most written about, the Roman economy has been the most written about topic in our field of Roman history for the last 15 or 20 years, in no small part thanks to the Oxford Roman Economy Project, spearheaded by Alan Bowman and Andrew Wilson. The growth in the Roman economy is not just an insider's academic quarrel. It has broader implications insofar as the fate of Rome and its economy has been held up by leading economists as an illustration justifying their approaches and conclusions. In particular, some argue in a new institutional approach that Roman institutions, including government, peace, infrastructure, property rights, and low taxes, encouraged free markets and trade, which in turn fueled economic growth until the heavy hand of government smothered a vibrant, growing economy. A celebration of free markets and a grim warning against excessive government. Others, prompted by contemporary environmental concerns, argue that the growth and decline of the Roman economy was driven by external factors such as climate change or contagious disease. Again, a grim warning in our current context. My central questions, I think, My central questions this evening are first, whether the institutions of the Roman imperial economy fostered ongoing growth until that growth was halted and reversed by some external force. And secondly, what light Pliny's natural history, which has been labeled the most popular natural history ever published, might shed on this question. The challenge is how to measure growth and come to an evidence-based choice among the different hypotheses and interpretations. The obstacle, as any Roman historian knows, is that we have no aggregate statistics for the Roman imperial economy and only very scattered data for population, wages, prices, no genuine time series. In the absence of reliable statistical data, Roman historians, beginning with Keith Hopkins in 1980, looked for proxies to assess economic performance by identifying the timing of growth and decline. My talk this evening will start with a short comment on proxies, concluding that they do not give us a reliable indication of the magnitude or timing of growth and decline. Consequently, I believe there is still a need to analyze culture and social structure in an effort to understand the dynamics of the economy. Now, obviously, I can't do this in any kind of comprehensive way in 1 hour, and so I want to concentrate on one central text, that is Pliny's Natural History, and how it resonates with current research in economics. My reason for focusing on this sprawling work of 400,000 words is the fact that Pliny wrote the natural history to preserve useful knowledge for the producers, the farmers, and the artisans in the empire. That's what he says. So let me start with proxies. Keith Hopkins pointed to the proxies of dated shipwrecks and volume of Roman coins in circulation. Their increases were evidence, in his view, of, quote, limited economic growth. And here I show you a graph that he published in 1980. This is of Roman silver coins, and it runs from the 150s BCE to 50 BCE, showing a dramatic growth in Roman silver coinage over that roughly century. Over the past decades, other proxies have been advanced as evidence for economic performance. Human stature, stature of livestock, volume of fine pottery finds. And I'm not going to review most of these because Andrew Wilson and others have effectively pointed out the weaknesses in those arguments. There are at least 3 difficulties in interpreting these proxies as evidence for growth in the Roman Empire as a whole. First, the data tend to be scattered across a vast empire and do not constitute a reliable sample or time series. Secondly, different regions grew and declined in different periods, making aggregate assessments for the whole empire problematic. And thirdly, the dating of material remains can be imprecise. The proxy that I want to focus on is lead pollution in the Greenland ice cap, because it overcomes all 3 of these obstacles and has received some high-profile attention from the likes of The Economist and the New York Times. 2 widely cited recent studies in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, co-authored by McConnell and Wilson, display breathtaking scientific precision in support of the hypothesis that the Roman economy was on a sustainable path of growth until the plague of 165 CE killed off a sizable part of the Roman population and sent the economy into decline from which it didn't recover for a millennium. The connection between lead pollution in Greenland and the Roman economy is that Roman mining and cupellation of silver for coinage, mainly in Spain, vaporized lead as a byproduct, which ended up in the Greenland ice cap and can serve as a proxy for economic activity. The improved, in fact, I think remarkable analytic precision of these studies in the past few years offers chronological resolution of plus or minus 2 years, and in turn presents lead pollution measurements year by year going back more than 3,000 years. For historians, this is an unmatched time series. Here's the graph that was published in the PNAS 2018 article that was used to justify the claim of sustainable growth through the Pax Romana. This graph, as you can see, is noisy. On the horizontal axis, you have the timeline running from 1000 BCE to 800 CE, and on the vertical axis, you have lead pollution. It's a noisy graph, and so I recruited 2 Stanford statisticians to help me reanalyze the data sets. And what we found was that the data do support 2 parts of the historical narrative in the PNAS article. Lead pollution increased around the turn of the era after Augustus brought an end to the devastating civil wars, and a substantial decline set in the wake of the Antonine Plague in the 160s CE. But, as this graph shows, the hypothesis about growth during the Pax Romana is not substantiated. This graph is a graph based on a breakpoint software statistical package, and it automatically identifies the points at which the trends change. And what you can see in this graph is that through the 2nd century BCE, lead pollution increased, and then dropped pretty dramatically during the Civil War era, bounced back up when Augustus established peace, but then it actually declined in the decades leading to the Antonine Plague. The Antonine Plague then also had a pretty dramatic effect in reducing lead pollution. So this graph shows that the data do not support a hypothesis of sustained growth through the century and a half of the Pax Romana between the death of Augustus and the period just prior to the Antonine Plague. If there had been continuing growth, as evidenced by lead pollution, the level should have risen noticeably over a period as long as a century and a half, from the first 2 decades of the Common Era to the 2 decades just prior to the plague. But in fact, it did not. And this graph shows you the trend line just for the Pax Romana. Because it's a log graph, it doesn't show the decline as steeply as it might. In fact, the decline in this graph is more than 20% over a century and a half. So there really is not, I think, any sound proxy to show continuing sustained growth in the Roman economy up to the Antonine Plague. Now, one can imagine arguments to explain why lead pollution is not a reliable reflection of economic activity. For example, the increasing substitution of gold coins for silver. But I think we're left with one of 2 positions. Either Greenland lead pollution is not a reliable proxy, or the economy was already in decline before the plague. I think the first is more likely. I think it's not a reliable indicator. So in the absence of reliable, quantifiable, aggregate proxies, it's worth drawing on as diverse a set of evidence as possible and looking again at texts for any light they can shed on assumptions and attitudes regarding economic behavior. Recent research has argued that in the run-up to the Industrial Revolution, there was a major shift in culture signaled by Diderot's Encyclopédie and its English predecessors, John Harris's Lexicon Technicum and Ephraim Chambers' Cyclopedia. A recent study finds a correlation between the geographical distribution of the Encyclopédie and faster economic growth in towns of 18th century France. Joel Makir's work on the antecedents to the Industrial Revolution provides a way of understanding this correlation. The 17th and 18th centuries witnessed the emergence of scientific and technical societies, formal and informal, to promote the exchange of ideas about science and how to apply it. And the most notable of these was the Royal Society. And then across Northern Europe, the Republic of Letters, a transnational network of the learned, emerged to exchange, test, and verify new ideas as a broadly accepted corpus of knowledge that could be used for technical advance. Harris's lexicon and Chambers' Encyclopedia, along with Diderot's Encyclopedia, were designed to serve this culture. Pliny's natural history was acknowledged as the ancient ancestor and is the closest analog to these 18th century works. Pliny wrote his monumental work for the express purpose of utilitas, utility, for farmers and artisans. So what insights can his text provide us into the economic ramifications of Roman productive culture? Now, for those of you who may not be familiar with the elder Pliny's work, just a brief description of his career in corpus, and forgive me if you all know all of this already. Pliny was a member of the Order of Roman Knights. This was the second rank after senators in the 0.01% of the richest families around the empire. He was appointed by emperors to a series of official posts in the provinces and in Italy, culminating with the prefecture of the imperial fleet at Misenum. In thinking about the economic implications of his work, Sir Ronald Syme wrote this about Pliny, quote, "More diligent perhaps and exacting than senators and consuls were the knights in the imperial service, and the financial duties of a procurator might stimulate precision and the spirit of inquiry." On Syme's characterization, Pliny is a more interesting witness to the economic culture than senators like Cicero. And it is certainly true, and any of you who have read it will know, that the quality of the natural history indicates that it was not meant to be a literary masterpiece for the aristocracy. The natural history was a monumental achievement, comprising 37 books and dedicated to the future Emperor Titus in 77 CE, 2 years before Pliny's heroic death in the eruption of Vesuvius. Pliny's boast about his achievement is curious. In total, he wrote, the books include 20,000 things worth knowing, 20,000 things worth knowing, res digni, drawn from 2,000 volumes written by more than 100 authorities. By one modern count, there are actually 437 authorities cited by Pliny, and I don't know of anyone who's done a recount of the 20,000 items. In any case, it represents an immense amount of material. And here I show you the organization of the books. So book 2 was dedicated to the cosmos and astronomy, followed by books on geography, then animals, plants, and minerals, with a special interest in medical remedies, about 1,200 remedies listed altogether. It's innovative in its scope, and its table of contents meant to help the readers find the items they're looking for. There's a broad organization under general rubrics, but then within the books, readers descend into wandering lists of diffuse items. Trevor Murphy described his experience of reading the whole work from beginning to end as, quote, referential dizziness. In this massive mashup of things worth knowing, the beginning of many of the books start with general moralizing comments which provide useful insights into Pliny's broad philosophical framework and values. Pliny's nephew and heir, the younger Pliny, described the work habits that enabled his uncle to write so much. The Natural History was just one of a series of works that the elder Pliny wrote, including javelin throwing from horseback. Those works are now lost. The elder Pliny, at least as pictured by his nephew, was the quintessential workaholic who never took a break, even for meals. And he worked into the night with a slave at his side reading texts. Given his rapid and relentless devouring of sources, it's not surprising that he had little time for first-hand observation, much less experimentation to test the truth of any of his 20,000 items. Moreover, there are inconsistencies and contradictions. Pliny's mission was to preserve the knowledge of the ancients, and Pliny's conception of that knowledge was a treasure chest of discrete facts rather than organized, coherent systems of knowledge. Among the basic inconsistencies was Pliny's conception of his target audience. His preface dedicates the work to Titus, and at the same time acknowledges that Titus is too busy to have time to read it. He apologizes for the, quote, rustic, foreign, and even barbaric vocabulary. Beyond Titus, Pliny claims that his books are intended for, quote, the humble crowd, the common mass of farmers or artisans, then those who with the leisure for study. But elsewhere in the work, Pliny lamented the fact that it was hard to reach ignorant rustics and that illiterate farmers had knowledge of medicinal herbs but no means of disseminating that knowledge because they couldn't read or write. I'll return to the difficulties of using the sprawling natural history for the purpose that Pliny articulated, and its curious afterlife reveals some of those difficulties. So what insights does the natural history provide into the culture, values, and attitudes influencing economic production? Much of the recent work on Roman economic growth has argued that imperial institutions nurtured growth through trade and dissemination of existing technology. But in the absence of major technical breakthroughs, this growth would have had diminishing marginal returns, and in the end was limited. So some growth, but limited growth. Pliny actually captures this fundamental ambivalence about the consequences of the Roman Empire for productivity and the quality of life. On the one hand, he sings the praises of the Pax Romana for bringing more natural resources under one peaceful political umbrella and encouraging trade. On the other hand, he repeatedly laments the moral decline that diverted Romans from the search for new knowledge to greed for riches. Adam Smith's basic premise about increased prosperity through exchange is specialization based on comparative advantage. Although at a few points Pliny deplores the brutality of Roman conquest, on the whole, the natural history is a celebration of the way in which Roman rule improved the quality of life by the exchange of new plants, animals, and minerals from around the empire. As the conqueror and imperial capital, Rome was the central magnet for trade, and as Pliny puts it, the judge of all things. And here I show you a schematic map, a simplified, oversimplified map of trade routes of the Roman Empire, but the point is that Rome is at the center. More broadly, Pliny expresses wondrous appreciation for Mother Nature. Quote, "This is the greatest miracle of life if we care to admit the truth. Think that the Scythian plant, for example, is brought from the marshes of Maeotis, euphorbia from Mount Atlas and from the Pillars of Hercules, and other plants, moreover, passing hither and thither from all quarters throughout the world for the welfare of mankind, all owing to the boundless grandeur of the Pax Romana. So truly do the gods seem to have given the human race the Romans, who are, as it were, a second son." So this celebration of empires focused overwhelmingly on the discovery of and trade in natural resources. Some interesting exceptions. Crafts and the trade in manufactured goods are very much secondary in the inventory of benefits. Perhaps the most interesting exception is the competitive manufacture and trade in pottery, and here, just as an illustration, I show you a beautiful Aretine vase made in central Italy, but found in Germany. After noting the famous centers of production, Pliny comments that these places enjoy fame as the products of their workshops are carried back and forth across land and sea. Altogether, though Pliny has no concept of aggregate economic production or per capita GDP, his natural history appreciates the benefits of trade in raising the quality of life by making new products available through exchange. Having said that, I think it's also true that the majority of these products fall into the category of luxuries benefiting a minority of the population. And luxuries is the appropriate segue into Pliny's pessimistic narrative of the moral decline of the Romans, which in turn had economic implications that resonate with recent research on the drivers of economic growth. Now, moralizing narratives of decline are standard fare in ancient literary works, as any classicist knows, and Pliny rails against the corruption of antique virtues throughout the 37 books in both expected and less expected contexts. Among the less expected, I myself would place his assertion that shellfish were the greatest source of the destruction of morals. Why shellfish? Well, because shellfish produce two of the most corrupting extravagances, pearls and purple dye. Despite the praise of commerce under the Pax Romana, Pliny asserts more than once that the innocence of a barter economy would be preferable and man would be better off without the gold or silver coins that Hopkins graphed. To make matters worse, the wealth of the empire underwrote an inflation in useless luxury in Pliny's eyes. Among the cases of grotesque conspicuous consumption cited by Pliny, Claudius's imperial slave manager, Drusillanus, is notable. His dinner service included one silver platter weighing 500 Roman pounds, complemented by 8 others weighing 250 pounds apiece. That is, his table service showed off nearly a ton of silver. And Drusillanus was an imperial slave. Pliny remarks that a special workshop had to be built in order to manufacture this dinner set. And he asks, ironically, how many fellow slaves were needed to carry these plates to the dining table. And these slaves carrying the platters to the dining table would have fallen into the Roman juris category of slaves who don't work. Pliny's condemnation of luxury had its roots in Stoic philosophy. He praised nature as the parent who generously made the cosmos for the benefit of mankind, and that generosity, in Pliny's view, should discourage efforts to improve on the purity of natural resources. Among the many examples of misplaced ingenuity in pursuit of luxurious novelty are perfumes. And here I show you some of the examples of perfume vases or perfume flasks that have been found. Perfume, because these are the expensive concoctions of multiple ingredients, the product of man's trifling with nature. And, to quote Pliny, perfumes serve the purpose of the most superfluous of all forms of luxury. For pearls and jewels do at least pass to the wearer's air, but unguents lose their scent at once and die in the very hour they are used, end quote. His point is that messing with the simple treasures provided by nature produces degeneracy, not progress, an attitude that does not encourage human innovation. At the end of Book 7, Pliny gives an extended inventory of great discoveries and innovations. It implicitly illustrates the lamentable decline of investigation, inquisitio. The range of inventions extends well beyond our category of technology to the arts, to forms of social, political, and economic organization, to customs and symbols, and then to some items that can only be described as bizarre to the modern mind. Among the artistic discoveries, Pliny includes musical instruments such as the flute. The social, political, and economic institutions on the list are an eclectic mix, including exchange, trade, towns, slavery, and others. The list of customs and symbols is even more eclectic. The diadem, diluting wine with water, the practices of divination. And then there are some truly strange novelties, such as dancing in armor and daily shaving. And this last one, daily shaving, is the sole discovery in the inventory credited to a Roman. So what does this account of things invented or discovered reveal about how Pliny understood technical advances in economic production? While including fundamental technologies of prior ages, such as the Neolithic domestication of plants and animals, Pliny's conception of innovation is much broader, certainly not limited to the technical and extending to what we might regard as trivial. He does not think of inventa primarily in the way that Francis Bacon conceived of the accumulation of useful knowledge in the early 17th century. Furthermore, in Pliny's inventory, the very breadth of the discoveries makes some of the absences noteworthy. Apart from astronomy, there are no discoveries in the physical sciences in that list, which in the modern era have been essential for technical advance. The chronological distribution of the inventors is also revealing. Of the 136 inventors in that particular inventory, it's striking that 112, or 82%, date from the prehistoric eras, with at least 60 of those coming from the world of Greek myth. And none of the technical inventions or discoveries come from imperial Rome. I don't count the sole Roman discovery, daily shaving, as a technical invention. Overall, it's striking that most, and certainly the most important technical advances in the list, were attributed to mythical heroes and gods. The implication is that Pliny did not view the crucial steps in the history of technology as progress based on human research and application. A survey of the inventions or discoveries in the natural history offers a basis for analyzing Pliny's conception of the process of inventio. The spectrum runs from first accidental discovery to deliberate observation to systematic observation to experimentation designed as a test of theory to a planned feedback loop from experimentally validated theory to application, what we today would call R&D. Pliny asserts that the two principal sources of discovery are the gifts of divine nature, the gods, and chance, casus, both of which conceive of humans as passive beneficiaries of good fortune. For example, the discovery of pozzolana to make Roman concrete, arguably the Roman discovery with the greatest impact, was a gift of nature in Pliny's account. The uses of plants for medicinal purposes that take up so much of the natural history are collectively characterized as, quote, the enormous and mysterious work of divinity. For Pliny, the most amazing discovery was that goat's blood could crack diamonds, the hardest of substances, and it exemplified the importance of chance. He asked, to whose inventio, or by what chance, casu, was this discovered? What inference could have led anyone to use the foulest of creatures for testing a thing of immense cost? Such an inventio belongs to the divine spirits, noumena, as well as every such gift. Nor is reason, ratio, to be sought in any part of nature. End quote. Well, never mind that goat's blood doesn't, in fact, crack diamonds. This statement coheres with the natural history's compilation of more than 20,000 discrete facts and has fundamentally important implications for how Pliny thinks that technical progress happens. For if there is no ratio or logic-based coherent knowledge to understand the natural world, no regularities, only mysteries revealed by chance, it is not possible to design programs of research to manipulate nature. The best one can do, and what Pliny aims to do, is to catalog past chance discoveries to avoid losing them. But crediting chance or the divine as sources of invention doesn't explain Pliny's idea of decline from better ancient times, when presumably that would have happened. And here he offers a systemic explanation that resonates with some of the current work by modern economic historians trying to explain the extraordinary takeoff of sustainable growth in 18th and 19th century Europe. One of the explanations is that after the fall of the Roman Empire, Europe was fragmented into competing kingdoms, and the competition fueled scientific and technical advances as never before. In his book, Escape from Rome, Walter Scheidel argued that Rome's collapse was actually the best thing that ever happened. It cleared the path for Europe's economic rise and the creation of the modern age. The fragmentation incentivized political, economic, scientific, and technological competition and breakthroughs that allowed Europe to surge ahead. Now, you might think, and it's been argued, that to compare the Roman Empire with early modern Europe is to invite anachronism. But in fact, Pliny offered a similar observation and explanation for the lack of discovery in his own day. He expressed surprise at the greater scientific production in the Hellenistic era 3 centuries earlier. He wrote, "When the world was at odds and split up into kingdoms, so many people devoted themselves to invention. Now, in these glad times of peace, no addition whatever is being made to knowledge by means of original research." Exaggeration. And in fact, even the discoveries of our predecessors are not being thoroughly studied. Now that every sea has been opened up and every coast offers a hospitable landing, an immense multitude goes on voyages, but their object is profit, not knowledge. And in their blind engrossment with greed, they do not reflect that knowledge is a more reliable means even of making a profit. End quote. Despite my mistrust of narratives of decline, there is actually, I think, some empirical support for Pliny's observation of a decline in investigation in the early empire, to be found in Kaiser and Irby Massey's Encyclopedia of Ancient Natural Scientists. Of the 352 roughly datable mathematicians and engineers known from the 6th century BCE to the 6th century CE, a millennium, the Hellenistic era with competing kings is by far the most heavily represented. And I give you a graph showing the increase in the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd centuries, and then the decline after Rome took over these regions and through the Pax Romana. As this graph shows, that during the height of the Hellenistic era, there were an average of 37 known mathematicians and engineers a year. In Pliny's own century, there were only 12. Pliny's own list of scientists and engineers who made great discoveries includes no Roman. Now, one can think of objections to this line of argument, and it's hardly fine-grained evidence. For instance, if Pliny himself were the source of most of the names, but he's not. Irby Massey and Kaiser's Encyclopedia draws from a wide range of ancient and Byzantine authors, and the decline starts well before Pliny's death. I believe that there's a convergence of evidence to support the view that imperial Rome did not generate a culture encouraging pursuit of useful and genuinely innovative knowledge, and Pliny was aware of it. Again, his list of history's 136 great inventors at the end of Book 7 includes not a single Roman scientist or engineer, and 82% are from prehistory. Now, there certainly were improvements made through the processes of dissemination and learning by doing. I don't doubt that. The empire's farmers and artisans could be highly skilled, and they did make improvements in technique and organization. Pliny lists some of them, concentrated in agriculture. In addition to the famous wheeled plow and Gallic harvester, illustrated in a bas-relief here, there were new methods of grafting, better whetstones to lessen the labor of harvesting, the screw press, and importantly, Columella's year-round cucumber. The cucumber oddly gets more attention in Pliny's natural history than the discovery of pozzolana to make concrete. I don't think that any of this contradicts Pliny's generalization that the intellectual culture of the Pax Romana was not as oriented to inquiry and invention of useful knowledge as in preceding eras. Well, did the natural history achieve its stated goal, the preservation of ancient knowledge to be used by the crowd of farmers and artisans? In one sense, yes. Pliny's monumental work survived as one of the most copied by scribes through the Middle Ages and most frequently reproduced in the early decades of the printing press. And it stands as our most extensive source for ancient science and technology. And yet, as for actual use, there's no evidence of its practical application in the century or more after Pliny's death. And it's very hard for me to imagine workers, farmers or craftsmen, looking to the 37 books of the natural history for specific information or medical remedies through its summarium, its table of contents. There's the obvious obstacle mentioned by Pliny himself, that the targeted audience was illiterate in many cases. And as for artisans who might have had limited literacy, access must have been limited by cost. Pliny's achievement was to organize 20,000 things worth knowing, but the organization was crude to say the least. Each of the 36 books contained many hundreds, in some cases more than 1,000 items, without much of a hierarchy of rubrics to guide the reader. For instance, Pliny offers 40 different remedies for rabies from dogbite, scattered in 17 chapters across 10 books. The remedies include she-goat's dung applied in wine, and to drink a decoction of the dung of badger, cuckoo, and swallow. I choose the deadly malady of rabies because it fascinated Pliny, and it is conceivable that some of the 1,200 herbal drugs for other illnesses may have worked. But we know in the case of rabies that none of those 40 remedies could have worked, and I have to wonder whether, since they're not identified in the table of contents, whether a reader with rabies could have gotten to the end of the 37 books before dying. Altogether, it's been observed rightly that the books devoted to agriculture were the most coherent and useful. For the rest, the chances of locating efficacious facts for practical use seem pretty slim to me. The curious afterlife of the natural history provides some intriguing insights about its usefulness. Despite claims that it disseminated technical knowledge throughout the Roman Empire, as I said, we have no mention of it for a century after Pliny's death, apart from his nephew's letter about his work habits. And when it is noticed in the late 2nd century, it's not for technical application. And then in the 3rd and 4th centuries, it was the primary source for Solinus Polyhistor and the anonymous Medicina Pliny, Pliny's medicines, which were excerpted from the natural history for geography and medicine, respectively. Solinus' work of geography and marvels was less than 1/10 the length of the full natural history, achieving, quote, almost unrivaled popularity in the Middle Ages and early modern period, and making Solinus, quote, the chief Latin geographer to a millennium. This exalted reputation didn't endure. Among German scholars of the 19th century, Solinus' dependence on Pliny earned him the sobriquet of Pliny's ape, and the Polyhistor was appraised as wretched and trivial. Mariella Millam had a more charitable description that I quite like. She describes it as, quote, the most miraculous worldview ever put forth in Europe. The Medicina Pliny was copied again and again, enjoying enormous popularity and influence through the Middle Ages. It comprised more than 1,100 remedies in 3 books. The first 2 books ordered intuitively by human physiognomy from head to foot, and the 3rd book for illnesses affecting the whole body. And for each illness, the symptoms are given, then followed by the remedies. The far better organization of the Medicina Pliny required piecing together items spread across the natural history. For example, Pliny's 40 remedies scattered in 10 books for rabid dogbite. Last year, the first English translation appeared of the Medicina with this disclaimer, quote, do not try these at home. The advice outlined in this text was meant for an ancient audience and does not constitute modern medical advice. Not only was the vast majority of ancient medicine ineffectual, in some cases it was injurious to patient health. Many of the medicines used are toxic. Yes, these remedies can be considered natural, but natural does not mean safe. The excerpting and thematic consolidation of the Medicina and Solinus were motivated in part, and they say this, by the unwieldiness and costliness of the full natural history of 400,000 words in 37 scrolls. Beginning in the Renaissance, the authority of Pliny's natural history began to be challenged, and then seriously undermined in the scientific revolution. In the 17th and early 18th century, new, better organized encyclopedias were published. The immediate predecessors to Diderot's famous Encyclopédie were the now much less well-known Lexicon Technicum, published by John Harris in 1704, and the Cyclopedia by Ephraim Chambers, published originally in 1728. Both of these English encyclopedias were intended to be comprehensive and touched on many of the same subjects as Pliny's natural history, meteorology, medicine, agriculture, for example. But the differences are also significant. Chambers conceives of knowledge as a system rather than an assortment of discrete facts. And so he's able to draw up, and I show you just a part of it here, he's able to draw up a visual representation of the hierarchy of organization of subject matter, and then with cross-references give the work much more intellectual coherence than Pliny's natural history. Chambers has entries for which Pliny has no close analogs, including arithmetic, algebra, geometry, physics, and optics. Both Pliny's and Chambers' encyclopedias were dedicated to the rulers of their day, Titus and then King George II, but the express purposes were really quite different. Whereas Pliny was driven by the passion to preserve ancient bits of wisdom being lost in his time, Chambers saw his work as a springboard to future discovery and application. And I give you some quotations from his preface. Quote, "Methinks I see trophies erecting to your majesty in the yet undiscovered regions of science, and your majesty's name inscribed to inventions at present held impossible." In contrast to Pliny's tired state of contemporary affairs stands Chambers' optimistic energy. Quote, "Your majesty commands a people capable of everything, extending your dominions by new settlements, some in increasing your people's wealth by new trades. Others will be employed in enlarging our knowledge by new discoveries in nature or new contrivances of art." Notice Chambers' celebration of the new and contrivances, whereas for Pliny, they had negative connotations of unnatural novelty. Chambers looks forward to yet to be imagined inventions. Pliny sees contrivances as a corruption of the virtuous gifts of nature. The culmination of Chambers' boast is that, quote, "The time seems at hand when we are no longer to envy Rome her Augustus and Augustan age, but Rome in her turn shall envy ours." Chambers' aim to digest a multitude of books points to another very obvious but also crucial difference. The advent of the printing press in the 15th century changed the dissemination of knowledge dramatically. Pliny's Natural History, a work of 400,000 words, was huge in a society where copies had to be made one by scribal hand. My estimate, based on Diocletian's price edict, is that to copy a set of 37 books would have cost about 9 months' pay for an artisan. In contrast to Chambers' Cyclopedia, which was more than 5 times as long and sold for 1/10 the price. The consequence is that the potential for dissemination of the Cyclopedia was notably greater, and indeed it went through more than 7 editions and translations. The 18th century encyclopedias were associated with the culture of useful knowledge manifested in formal and informal societies. Pliny gives no hint of such cultural institutions in Rome of his day, and indeed writes that he was ridiculed for his efforts. The emperors did support learning, but it was in the form of chairs of rhetoric, philosophy, and medicine. I know of no analog to the 18th century Republic of Letters in the Roman world. So to conclude, I believe that for all of his quirkiness, Pliny had insights about the consequences of the Pax Romana, which should be taken into account in thinking about the dynamics of the Roman economy. On the one hand, imperial institutions such as peace, public infrastructure, and law surely encouraged the growth in the economy as goods and ideas from corners of the empire were brought to Rome and then disseminated more widely. On the other hand, I think there is evidence to support Pliny's view that in the absence of competition, the culture of research, inquisitio, declined during the Pax Romana, limiting the potential for major technical breakthroughs to generate sustained growth. And then, finally, today, I think we may well sympathize with Pliny's fundamental belief that the reckless exploitation of nature can be profoundly detrimental. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. We have maybe 5 minutes or so in case there are any questions, and we have a microphone for anyone in this room able or wishing to ask a question. So any questions from our audience here? Might I abuse my place then?
Of course.
And ask a question, which is, if we accept that Pliny's view of innovation was true of something broader in the Roman Empire at that time, can you speculate on why that might be the case, that a very successful empire could sustain itself without that culture of innovation?
So there was a culture of learning, but it was a culture of learning ancient texts with a deep respect for the past. And so Alice Gellius gives us a number of descriptions of the kind of intellectual exchange that went on that in some ways was comparable to the salon culture of early modern Europe. But it's all about who can quote Ennius or Cato most effectively. It's not about the excitement of experimentation and search for new knowledge. And so it is a different set of cultural values, and it goes back far enough that I don't think we know how it began. I don't think that that's possible. And just in general, I think often it's difficult to identify specific reasons for deeply held cultural views. I don't know whether that answers your question.
That helps me. Any other thoughts or questions for anyone?
Yes.
Yes, Philemon.
Thanks. It's not,
Philemon, can we just wait for the microphone so that others can hear the question?
Thanks. This won't be a very well formulated question, but thank you for this. I'm asking myself about the distribution of experts, scientific experts who we know of, and whether I got your point that the sources being used are very various and chronologically various, but I wondered if something about that culture of quoting certain people plays into a tradition in which we're more likely to hear about experts in which they live in certain centuries. If you ask me to name an aeronautical engineer, I might come out with Daedalus, which doesn't tell us much about aeronautical engineers, but of who I've been reading, I suppose, is what I mean.
I certainly wouldn't suggest that the graph that I showed you of the distribution of mathematicians and engineers is a sort of accurate representation of distribution. And it is true that they were more likely to be, I think, in the Greek East. But a lot of these come from Byzantine authors who would have known the Greek sources very well. But given that the Roman Empire, the Romans dominated the Mediterranean for 600 years or more, a population of 50 to 60 million or more, that's a huge time span of a large population of many generations. And when I have looked at some of the modern compilations of the greatest inventions in history, starting with the Neolithic Revolution or even before, the centuries for the Roman Empire, first, second centuries CE, are a blank. And that's pretty striking given that and it's certainly true that the engineers were very skilled. The emphasis was, I think, more on public than on privately items manufactured for private use. So the technology incorporated in the baths was quite sophisticated. Not sure that there were, concrete was used, of course, but what I don't think is true is that baths, building baths, had knock-on effects in fueling the economy for yet more productive technology.
Thank you.
Yes.
Any other questions from anyone? So I think I may therefore express on behalf of everyone in this room and elsewhere my great thanks to you for an exciting encyclopedic display. Thank you for stimulating us and asking us to look across the centuries at the 18th century as well as back at that period, using methods I found quite fascinating.
Can I ask one quick question of the audience? How many of you knew about John Harris or Ephraim Chambers before this evening? I'm not surprised, Nicholas. Okay. But I didn't know until I got into reading, and it really makes for quite interesting comparisons. Anyhow, thank you.
Anyway, very many thanks indeed, Richard Saller.